Annyeong, I'm Lisa, and welcome to Chosun Chronicles. Currently, we experience a lot of turbulence in different parts of the world, with military conflicts, terrorist attacks, and tensions balancing on the brink of direct confrontations. The Korean Peninsula is no exception. Relations between the two Koreas remain extremely tense, fueled by ongoing mutual provocations and external pressures. In times like this, it's crucial to reflect on the importance of peace and remember that even bad peace is better than a good war, even if it sounds trivial. So today, I'm honored to have Dan Gudgeon, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna and PhD degree graduate of the University of North Korean Studies. Dan will help us better understand the peace issue on the Korean Peninsula from the perspective of peace movement in South Korea. So then, welcome. Thank you for coming today. And can you please tell us a little bit about your current research?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to see you again after our time studying together at the University of North Korea, North Korean Studies in Seoul. So lovely to see you and meet like this. As you said, I'm currently working at the University of Vienna as a postdoctoral researcher under Professor Rüdiger Frank, who many North Korean watchers will know for his insights into engagement with North Korea and the North Korean economy, etc. I am studying mostly the interkorean peace process and why people get involved with it or why people don't get involved with it, and what leads to progress and what prevents progress in that interkorean peace process. I'm also teaching a couple of classes at the University of Vienna for graduate master students that are studying East Asian economy and society. So we have lots of students from around the world, a lot from Europe, but also from further afar. And yeah, they're fantastic. They're really enthusiastic about understanding East Asia and the dynamism that is so significant in East Asia.
That sounds really fascinating. And I think your students must be very happy that you're talking about them in this way.
I hope so.
Okay, let's start from the basics. Then, what does the Korean peace movement actually mean, and how can we describe it? What are the main goals, values?
Yeah, okay. First of all, I think I have to be quite careful when I speak about this because obviously I'm not Korean. And so this is only kind of my interpretation. And actually, it's quite a diverse movement. So I won't be able to reflect everybody's thoughts or opinions. And obviously, I come at this with my own preconceptions, my own background that was formed outside of Korea, looking at conflicts or intractable conflicts all around the world. So that's kind of a disclaimer before we begin. But yeah, I would say that you could break down the Korean peace movement's goals maybe into 5 different things. But of course, these overlap and they merge into one another. But if I talk about those 5 things, I would say the first one would be that because there is a continuous security threat on the Korean Peninsula, the two Koreas are at war. North Korea has nuclear weapons. South Korea has an alliance with the US that has nuclear weapons. So the first kind of goal of part of the peace movement would be to remove that security threat and make sure that the mistake, or not the tragedy of the Korean War does not repeat itself. And I think at its most basic, that would be through North Korean reform. So a lot of approaches towards the Korean conflict see the North Korea slowly adapting its system, embracing market reforms and then political reforms, kind of replicating some aspects of the South Korean system towards what is called a soft landing for North Korea. So when North Korea changes gradually, and then the need for nuclear weapons is slowly taken away, and then the possibility of a conflict slowly diminishes. So this goal could be called the North Korea soft landing. That would be number one. And then these goals are not necessarily compatible. So number 2, 3, 4, and 5, they might disagree with that perspective. So that's just something to bear in mind. A second key goal or rationale for the peace movement would be the need for unification. So the Korean Peninsula was not divided upon the wishes of the Korean people. Despite Korea not being an aggressor in the Second World War, the country was divided in two by external powers, the Soviet Union and the US. And that is very much unnatural. Okay, so we have an ethnic nationalism that exists on the Korean Peninsula, and that by virtue of that nationalism's endpoint would traditionally be unification. So getting rid of this unnatural division. And I think it's important to consider, like, people in Europe or the West often think of ethnic nationalism as something negative or dangerous because of the history that we have in Europe, particularly with ethnic nationalism and what it led to. And I think it's important for us not to project our own understanding of ethnic nationalism onto the Korean Peninsula. So in Korea, that ethnic nationalism, I mean, in Korea, it's not even called ethnic nationalism, it's just nationalism. They don't need to distinguish between that. But in Korea, with the Japanese kind of colonial expansion over the peninsula, ethnic nationalism was like the logic or rationale for the independence movement. Okay, so it was an anti-colonial liberation ideology. So we can be, how do we distinguish ourselves from Japan, who have tried to incorporate us into the Japanese state against our wishes, and they're denying us our culture, our language, even our Korean names. So Korean nationalism is like this liberation ideology to distinguish Koreans from their Japanese oppressors. Okay, so that would be one kind of aspect that exists within the peace movement. And I think a lot of international perspectives that look at the Korean peace movement sometimes disparage the peace movement because of this this whole thread of ethnic nationalism. And as I've just explained, I don't think it is something that should be disparaged, but actually, like, the reality of the peace movement is much more nuanced than this, and actually goes much further than just being based on ethnic nationalism. We need to reunify the Minjok, the people. And actually, I would argue that in Korea, the thinking about how to deal with division and the peace process is really developed and arguably at the forefront of any kind of theoretical movement anywhere in the world to deal with protracted conflict. Okay, how do we deal with conflicts that last decades or last generations? I would argue that South Korean perspectives on that are really nuanced and very much well developed. Okay, so to talk about these other three perspectives or goals in the peace movement, I think it's important to understand a little bit more about Korean division. Okay, so these other three could be understood as movements to transcend division, move beyond division. So in Korean, that's called palbundan, transcending division. And in this debate, there's like division, unification, peace building, and that different parts of the movement place different emphasis on different aspects. Okay, so in Korea, after division, this ethnic nationalism that existed about, like, we are the Korean people, because it was distorted by North and South Korea claiming that they were the only legitimate Korea, they were they were the legitimate government for the whole peninsula, then the us-them boundary between inside, outside, friend, enemy, became really really dichotomous between South and North Korea. So both kind of claiming that they are the real Korea, and the only way that you can win is by getting rid of the other one. They cannot coexist by that rationale or that logic, right? That we are the real Korea. So I think often conflict around the world, in other countries also, relies on this very dichotomous division of us and them. We are good, they are bad. It is safe inside, dangerous outside. And this kind of absolutizes the differences between us and them. And that's what happened on the Korean peninsula. Okay, so within South Korea, it was like, if you are only South Korea is the real Korea. North Korea should not exist, it cannot exist. And only by being like liberal or free or capitalist can you really be a Korean. Okay, anything else is not really Korean. And this played out through anti-communism within South Korea. So for the third group that I wanted to talk about, because of this dichotomy that can only be resolved by the extermination of one group, then when they start thinking about how to overcome this, they searched for a different answer, which was a peace process that kind of transcends this us and them and creates instead something new. So it's like a third way. So peace building, not demanding one or the other, but creating something new. And that was actually the experience explained by the NGO that I worked for in Korea for 4 years. And I actually have a quote from the Secretary General of that NGO. And he said, when he first went to North Korea, these were kind of his reflections. Okay, so he said, even though we are the same ethnicity, our life trajectories have been completely different. So now we think differently and we act differently. But when I first went to North Korea, I tried to change them unilaterally. I tried to just show them that if they only did things the South Korean way, they could develop and everything would be okay. But what I realized after cooperating with them on the project site was that only if I was willing to change, would they also be willing to change. So change cannot be one way, cannot be unilateral. It has to be mutual. So now I believe in the possibility of change, and that together we can move in a better direction for everyone. So that's like this whole idea in the peace process that you cannot have peace just based on getting rid of one of the other. There needs to be some respect and acknowledgement of difference, and then the willingness for both sides to change. Because actually, if you are just in a regime competition forever and you insist on superiority, that will be destructive for both sides, because you deny that you have problems in your own society that you need to deal with. And you also ignore the fact that you are vulnerable to the other. So if South Korea acknowledges that they're vulnerable to North Korean nuclear weapons or to common threats such as climate change or other climate-related issues that don't acknowledge the border, such as African swine flu in pigs, in livestock, or natural disasters like wildfires, like they don't know about borders, right? They don't care about borders. And also diseases like tuberculosis and malaria. In the last year, there was a massive increase in malaria in South Korea because it hasn't been got rid of in North Korea. So in communities near the border, there was a lot of malaria. And yeah, things like that. South and North Korea actually need to deal with each other and cooperate with each other. Okay, so yeah, because the peace process for these people, kind of this us-them border, they're trying to kind of tear it down and get rid of or make it transient, the distinction between like us and them, self and other. For me, personally, that was really inspiring, because if you look around the world at other conflicts, usually it's this self-other, us-them dichotomy is at the heart of the conflict, but also even within societies, with the way that minorities are treated. Often it's this us-them distinction. So if you tear that down, that's where actually we can search for common solutions to the world's problems. So actually, I think this is a really inspiring part of the Korean peace process, which is why I talked about it for so long. Okay. And then, so then just two more. If I look at number 4, the fourth reason. So it's again about division. So the fourth kind of motive for the peace process, or for peace movement, some people in the peace movement, would be to get rid of division violence in South Korea. So problems in South Korean society that are caused because of division. So again, we need to think about what the impact of division was on South Korean society, because you had division with this dangerous other in North Korea, this dangerous communism other. Division demanded of South Korean society uniformity. It demanded that you conform, because if you are a little bit different, then it could be a sign that you're a communist, right? That you're an infiltrator from the north. So South Korean leaders demanded this conformity, and they also demanded that ordinary people mobilize for the state, to protect the state. So if you divert from what the South Korean state kind of determines is a good or normal South Korean, then you kind of become the enemy within, like the enemy within South Korea. I mean, obviously, this was much more prevalent during the Cold War, before democratization, but the remnants of it still exist in Korean society today. So if you think about in South Korea, there still is this kind of refusal to acknowledge digressions from the uniformity or conformity. Yeah. So in Korea, there's obviously there's a LGBTQ community, and there's in the conservative strata of South Korean society, there's a real anti-LGBTQ movement, and I think that has its roots in this: you are either like us and you conform like us, and you are not allowed to be different. But also with gender conflict. So for South Korea was a very militarized society throughout the Cold War, and men had to perform certain roles, like you have to do conscription to be considered a man, and women also had to do certain roles within that, and women faced discrimination for some of the things that they were not able to do in society, and they were expected to be dutiful and protected by men, and so often excluded or prejudiced against due to militarism in society. For a whole part of the peace movement, they would argue that we need to get rid of this division violence within South Korea, right? So their focus is more on the peace movement to kind of resolve problems in South Korea, because this whole legacy of division with that dichotomy of refusing to recognize the other, that also extends to refusing to acknowledge your political opponent other. Okay, so throughout division, the conflict was this external threat was utilized to legitimize the authoritarian regimes in South Korea. So we have to have the authoritarianism, otherwise the communists will threaten our country. Okay, but you might think that has disappeared with democratization, but as we saw with Yoon's comments, President Yoon's comments last week or 2 weeks ago when he did the martial law declaration, he's talking about protecting the country from pro-North Korean anti-state forces.
북한의 불법적인 핵무장과 미사일 위협 도발에도 GPS 교란과 오물 풍선에도 민주노총 간첩 사건에도 거대 야당은 이에 동조할 뿐 아니라 오히려 북한 편을 들면서 이에 대응하기 위해 고군분투하는
Well, the majority of people didn't believe that, don't understand why he's talking about that. So it just demonstrates how this whole anti-communist narrative is still utilized for political ends within South Korea. So I think that leads me on to the fifth and final point or thread in this peace movement. And that's, we have to, it's for the Democrats or for the liberals in South Korean society, I believe we have to have a peace process with North Korea to ensure that South Korea becomes or remains a normally functioning democracy. So, because otherwise, conservatives will continue to use the threat of North Korea to implement authoritarianism. So that would be the fifth kind of motive that I identified exists in the peace movement. And the interesting thing is, like, actually North Korea isn't important for this motive, okay? The important thing is protecting the South Korean democracy that South Korean liberals feel they constructed. So the need to have a peace process with North Korea is not because you're set on ethnic unification or anything like that. It's because you don't want conservatives to keep using the North Korean threat to jeopardize your democracy. So, and I think this is really prevalent in among mainstream South Korean liberals. So yeah, that's my answer about the 5 different motives or strains in the Korean peace movement.
Then thank you so much for such a comprehensive clarification of peace movement's motives. Let's name them once again. Just roughly speaking, there are 5 motives. First one is elimination of security threats, right?
Yeah.
Second one is unification issue. The third one is cooperation and peace building between the 2 Koreas,
Yeah.
right? The fourth is eliminating division violence narratives
inside South Korea.
And the fifth one is advocating for democracy, democratic principles, right?
Yeah, in South Korea.
In South Korea, of course. So thank you so much. Now let's dive a little deeper into the historical context. Could you walk us through the origins of the South Korean peace movement? When did it emerge, actually, and what were the driving forces behind it?
Okay, so it's an interesting question where to start with this, but if we think about the situation after the Korean War, this anti-communism really was became well established within South Korea because of the destruction of the Korean War. So there was no desire for peaceful unification expressed openly in South Korean society because, you know, you had this really destructive war, and also then you had anti-communist narrative kind of becoming established within South Korea, so that to be accepted as a South Korean, you had to demonstrate that you really despised North Korea and that you didn't have any sympathy with communism or leftism. So there was no space to have a peace movement after the Korean War. I mean, interestingly, there was a presidential candidate in 1956 that ran on and one of his main policies was peaceful unification. And he was arrested and sentenced to death several years after that for supposedly being a spy for North Korea and for breaking the national security law by stating that you could have peaceful unification. So there was no space to have a peace movement in the 1950s. And that continued after Park Chung-hee became the president, after his coup. in 1961. So there was no space for peace movement, and anti-communism really dominated the whole of society, okay? And then you had in 1972, there was the, between North and South Korea, there was a joint communique that kind of agreed on 3 principles for unification. And this was prompted by the détente between China and the USA. However, within the same year that this happened, so obviously there might have been some hopes about a change in environment away from anti-communism and towards rapprochement with the North, but this was very quickly destroyed because both North and South Korea created a new constitution in 1972 that solidified the top leader's authority. So Park Chung-hee's Yushin constitution really it made him president for life, and it was a real crackdown on any kind of semblance of democracy that existed or any freedom that existed. So for people in South Korea that were fighting against authoritarianism in the 1970s, they thought that the democracy has to come first because the dictatorship always utilizes the conflict to justify its authoritarian rule. So there's democratization is the goal, okay? And this existed throughout the 1970s. And because of anti-communism, again, it was very dangerous to say anything other about North Korea. And many people were arrested just and thrown into prison for a long time just for being accused of being a left wing or of having read some, Marxist literature. You know, this would mean that you would be sent to prison. So again, there was not really any peace movement to speak of in the 1970s, okay? But Park Chung-hee was assassinated in 1979, and I think a lot of South Korean people thought that democracy would then come. But as we know, another dictator launched a coup, and Chun Doo-hwan became the president from the military, and he declared martial law all over the country in 1980. So there were protests against this, democratization protests against this all across the country. But in Gwangju, in the city of Gwangju in Jeolla province, these protests escalated, and Chun Doo-hwan sent paratroopers into Gwangju, and they the South Korean army killed hundreds of South Korean civilians, including women and children. Okay, and this was a real shock for the South Korean democratization movement. And I mean, news of this didn't come out immediately because the authoritarian government tried to suppress any reporting of this. They also tried to blame all of the killings on North Korean infiltration and North Korean uprising. Okay, but what happened because of Gwangju was that the democratization movement came to the realization that there could be no democratization unless the North Korean issue was dealt with, because the authoritarian leaders would continue to present the South Korean democratization movement as just being North Korean spies or being influenced by North Korea. So that meant that the democratization movement had to break this hold of anti-communism over society. They had to challenge this anti-communism. And in challenging this very dichotomous, binary anti-communist narrative, it meant they had to talk about North Korea and think about what North Korea was and what was the way to get towards Korean peace and democratization. So the taboo of talking about North Korea and the taboo of anti-communism was broken within the democratization movement, not for the whole population, but within the democratization movement. So they started talking about peace and unification in the 1980s, okay, within particularly the student movement, but also within religious groups. Okay, so Christian activists played a very strong role in the South Korean democratization movement. If you've heard of liberation theology, that's famous in South America, it was also very well developed and advanced in South Korea. So anyway, we had South Korean National Council of Churches in Korea, the NCCK. They wanted to deal with this peace and unification issue, okay? But they knew that if they acted independently, they could still be attacked by the government for being pro-North Korea or pro-communist. So what they did was they approached the World Council of Churches, which is an economical organization based in Switzerland, which kind of has church organizations in each country are members of this World Council of Churches. Okay, so the NCCK, National Council of Churches in Korea, approached the World Council of Churches and said, we want to talk to Christians in North Korea. And the negotiations went on, and there is a Korean Church Federation in North Korea. That's the National Council of Churches of Korea's counterpart in North Korea. And the World Council of Churches actually managed to arrange that they had a meeting with between South Korean Christians and North Korean Christians in Switzerland in 1986. And this was the first ever meeting of non-government organizations between North and South Korea or non-state, non-party groups from North and South Korea since the Korean War. So that was the first time in 36 years. And they met together in Switzerland. And it was really emotional for the participants. But after that, this church group in South Korea, or group of churches, the National Council of Churches in Korea, became much more activated regarding the peace and unification discourse. And so did other parts of the civil society kind of start following them. Okay. And then obviously with South Korean democratization in 1987, there became a little bit of space to talk about unification and peace. Okay. So the National Council of Churches in Korea, they made this declaration in February 1988 called Declaration of the Churches of Korea on National Unification and Peace. And this kind of embraced the principles that the South Korean president had, of the joint communique from 1972, but also added two new principles about protection of human rights and democratic participation. But this declaration actually was kind of influenced the Norteu government. So when they made their Nordpolitik, 국방정책, it's been revealed that they were influenced by this NCCK declaration, which then became the basis for the basic agreement between North and South Korea in 1991. So we can see how civil society led the way in breaking the taboo of meeting with North Koreans and then creating declarations that then influenced government policy. Okay, so that's kind of the big first one would be the churches. But there was also with the women's movement. So obviously the women's movement was also very active in the democracy movement, but they're also interested in talking about the impact of militarization on women in South Korean society. They actually managed to meet in Tokyo between Japanese women's groups, North Korean women's groups, and South Korean women's groups. And the theme was peace in Asia, the role of women. Okay, so they met in 1991, and then there were also meetings hosted in Seoul, and then in Pyongyang, and then again in Tokyo in 1993. And they discussed the issues of Korean unification, the legacy of Japanese colonization, comfort women issue. This is when the comfort issue first was came out onto the international stage, but it was North Korean women, South Korean women, and Japanese women talking about it together, and also about women's rights. Okay, so you have this, the women's movement also playing a kind of pivotal role in creating meetings between these three countries in Northeast Asia. And then they also were kind of active within South Korea. So in South Korea, traditionally, there's a points system for people that have been to the military. Okay, so every man has to go to the army because of conscription. So you have these points on that help you with pension or with unemployment benefits, etc., etc. But it's only open to people that have been to the military. But of course, women didn't go to the military, and also disabled people didn't go to the military. But in the 1990s, this women's peace campaign, they campaigned to get rid of this in South Korea. And at the end of the 1990s, in 1999, they were successful in getting this ordinance deemed as adjudged as being unconstitutional. Okay, and they also, throughout the 1990s, they protested against the military budget and arguing that, when nearly 20% of the military budget is being spent on defense, but less than half of 1% is being spent on women's welfare. So the women's movement was also very active, both in inter-Korean engagement, but also at the beginning of the 90s, but then also in kind of struggling against this militarization of society within South Korea. And those meetings at the beginning of the 1990s, they were only attended by like a few dozen people. But when it was held in 2002, like after the Inter-Korean Summit in 2000, then it was attended by 700 people. So we can see that it grew, and it was kind of, how do we implement this peace agreement between North and South Korea? And that's kind of testament to the continuous efforts of women's groups to make sure that the peace process included women and that women's issues were always kept on the agenda. Okay, so that's kind of the second big strain. We had churches, then we had the women's groups, and the third one that I want to talk about is the humanitarian NGOs. Okay, so as you know, in 1995, North Korea revealed that it was having a lot of difficulties in feeding its population for various reasons, but it was kind of adjudged by the UN that went in that North Korea was suffering from famine. So North Korea turned to the international community and asked for help. Originally not from South Koreans, they didn't want South Korean help because of the ongoing conflict and the fact that assistance from South Korea, they were worried that it could be like tainted to try and harm the North Korean population, or they were also worried that it would be used as a kind of propaganda victory for South Korea. So originally they didn't want to accept it. And I think at the time, the government, South Korean government, was also not particularly enthusiastic because they thought that this would mean that there was an opportunity that North Korea would collapse. But what happened was, in civil society, as news of this famine spread in South Korea, they started organizing and they created a kind of movement to assist the Northern Brethren that were undergoing such difficulties because of a lack of food. So religious groups and civil society groups started campaigning to provide assistance to North Korea. If you think like providing assistance to the enemy, basically, to the people that had been the enemy for the previous 50 years. So it was difficult, right? They were fighting against it should have been difficult to be fighting against the established narrative of anti-communism, but they were incredibly successful in mobilizing the people. And the kind of rationale that they presented was, and I quote from one of these NGOs that started in 1996, let's melt the differences in ideology and system, as well as long-standing hatred, with our warm compatriotism to help our fellow countrymen and women who are dying of starvation, and thereby accelerate the era of unification. So what they did was they kind of tried to get lots of people to participate in fundraising, but that was originally illegal under the national security law, because why would you be able to help the enemy? So these NGOs actually lobbied the government so that the government had to change the law, because the government at the time, Kim Jong-sam, was restricting all of the aid to North Korea in the name of national security. So the NGOs lobbied and protested to change the law so that they could fundraise, but then also change the law so that they could make direct contact with North Koreans. So if you think this has been divided for 50 years, nobody was allowed to talk to each other, but these South Korean NGOs built such a big movement in the mid-1990s that they had forced the government to change the law. And this kind of nationwide campaign really helped to change the public image of North Koreans away from being the enemy into being kind of brothers and sisters in need. Okay, and because this was such a big national campaign, and all of the major religious groups participated, they kind of made it so that ordinary people could participate. So if you were a farmer, you could donate eggs. If you were a fisherman or a fisherwoman, you could donate fish or seaweed. If you had, a family, you could donate old clothes. Any sector of South Korean society could participate. And I think that's very important for a peace process, because it kind of keeps people involved and feeling like they're part of the process. Okay, so then, they started going to North Korea and running these humanitarian assistance cooperation projects. They started visiting in 1999 and then increasingly went to visit. So that was like Kim Dae-jung, the president of South Korea from 1998 to 2003. His policy was like, because there's such a lack of trust between government, we'll send civil society first, government later. So it meant that NGOs were kind of trailblazing inter-Korean relations. But the positive impact that it had was that when there were problems at the governmental level between North and South Korea, so they stopped talking to each other, because there were still activities going on between South Korean NGOs and their North Korean counterparts, the momentum could be found and the process could be sustained. So, for example, in 2002, there was like a clash in the West Sea between the navies of South and North Korea. And so they had to freeze talks, and the North and South Korean government kind of said, we can't talk to each other. But at that time, the NGOs kept talking, and it was the NGOs that could then pass messages to counterparts and maintain the peace process through difficult periods. So not only did these NGOs kind of change the perspective towards North Koreans within South Korea, they also helped sustain the peace process when there were problems between governments. Okay, and then the third thing that they did that was really important was because they were working with North Koreans on the project site within North Korea, within these development projects or humanitarian projects. First of all, they had to bring a lot of experts from South Korea from different fields. Okay, so they also took with them sometimes the donors. So ordinary South Koreans that had sponsored these NGOs were taken with the NGOs to go to North Korea with the experts on the projects and meet North Koreans. So they were able to kind of establish or create these human relationships between North Koreans and South Koreans that didn't exist and couldn't exist for 50 years. But if you think about it, like ultimately conflict starts because of human relationships, right? Even if you think, oh, it's politics and structure, etc., etc., the heart of any conflict is human relationships. So also the heart of any resolution or conflict transformation has to come through human relationships. And that's what these NGOs did when they worked together on the project site. Okay. And it wasn't, the other thing they had to do was they had to deal with conflict, because if you're working for some development project like an agricultural project or a factory project, etc., there's going to be conflict between the people working, right? They're going to fall out about who should do what and what's the best way, etc. And these North Koreans and South Koreans on the project site had to deal with that conflict and overcome that conflict. So it was like a kind of microcosm of a future Korean unification, right? It's not denying conflict. It's saying, okay, we are different. There is conflict. We need to deal with the conflict. So I think this experience of South Korean humanitarian and development NGOs is really, really kind of significant and important. And if we look at the Moon Jae-in peace process of recent years, I think one reason that it collapsed so quickly was because there was not this cooperation between non-governmental levels, because everything was only going through at governmental levels, and there are various reasons for this, which I don't need to go into. That it meant that when there was a problem at the top level, like the collapse of the Hanoi summit, there was no way to sustain the peace process, because the other things that happened in the non-governmental sector, or less controlled by the governmental sector, didn't exist. So I think that really highlights the significance of the NGO peace movement. Yeah. I thought I would do a shorter answer, but it was just as long. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you for such a deep look into the history of the peace movement itself and the South Korean 20th century history. And actually, as you said at the very beginning, that currently it's hard to imagine when once South Korea witnessed military regimes, right? And I also find it fascinating and unexpected that peace movement, South Korean peace movement, is deeply connected with the country's own struggle for democracy and equal rights. South Koreans at that time were reluctant to help North Korea because for many years they thought that North Korea is a bad country, is a threat to its national security, because it's hard to believe it now after we know that South Korea is one of the main suppliers of humanitarian aid to North Korea, right? It's kind of unexpected idea. So how has the peace movement evolved in recent years, particularly with change in interkorean relations? What role do NGOs and civil society play today in promoting peace on the Korean Peninsula?
Good question. I think that the peace process stopped quite abruptly in the peace process. Inter-Korean cooperation and engagement stopped very abruptly in 2010, when the Cheonan South Korean naval corvette was sunk. The South Korean president at the time, Lee Myung-bak, introduced these May 24th measures that made intercooperation incredibly difficult, almost impossible. Yeah, so that made the inter-Korean cooperation engagement incredibly difficult. And then also with the increase in sanctions in 2016, 2017 against North Korea from the UN, it kind of made inter-Korean cooperation even more difficult. Okay, so the Korean peace movement assumed that when the Democratic Party came back to power, the peace movement would be able, or the engagement and cooperation movement would be able to restart. Okay, but that was after this 10-year or 2 consecutive conservative administrations, the Lee Myung-bak administration and then the Park Geun-hye administration. But what happened after Moon Jae-in came to power was that the South Korean cooperation and engagement movement realized that because of these international sanctions, it was impossible to return to cooperating with North Korea in the way that they did in the 2000s. So it was no longer just a Korean problem. These international sanctions meant that because they are so far-reaching and encompass so many things, that for South Korean peace movement to engage with North Korea requires US approval, requires UN Security Council approval. So what the peace movement started doing then was starting to cooperate even more with their kind of counterparts in the US or in international humanitarian or development organizations to try and build a argument and build a consensus that claimed that these inter-Korean cooperation activities were a pivotal part of resolving tensions on the Korean Peninsula, and they were a good way to encourage North Korea towards engagement and to move away from the continued securitization of the problem. So you see, after Moon Jae-in became president, that these NGOs trying to work a lot more on lobbying activities and lobbying for the peace process. It seemed to be going okay, but then obviously Hanoi summit between the US and North Korea collapsed. And then North Korea also was angry at South Korea for not restarting the Kaesong Industrial Complex or the Gumgangsan Tourist Complex. So North Korea also didn't want to engage with South Korea. So I think the peace movement in South Korea was incredibly frustrated that it was kind of inhibited from doing what it knew that it could do so well during this time. And that has led to a long process of introspection about what the goals are for the South Korean peace movement and how to move forward in this very securitized environment where North Korea nuclear weapons do not seem to be going anywhere, and where South Korea, US, Japan military cooperation is increasing. So I think that's one kind of key thing that they're trying to do in the last few years. And then also within South Korea. So how to lobby effectively within South Korea or gain support amongst the South Korean people for a peace process. And also, as I said earlier, kind of dealing with division violence and pointing out how the continued conflict makes certain things in South Korea that are unnatural appear normal. So I think this is where the kind of peace process is at. But also perhaps now cooperating more with other peace processes around the world to kind of learn from their experiences and to also let more people around the world know about the continued difficulties faced by the South Korean peace movement.
And speaking about conservative presidents, so they usually are very skeptical about these peace activities. So how does the peace movement respond to the conservative criticism?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because in the early 2000s, the conservatives also participated in the peace process to a certain extent. They also thought that this ethnic solidarity was important. So they participated in humanitarian assistance to North Korea. The conservatives also participated. And they also thought that North Korea represented an economic opportunity. So they thought that it was good that inter-Korean cooperation projects should focus on the economy. So conservatives did originally participate in the peace process. I think the big change was after the North Korean nuclear test in 2006. And this is where the conservatives started to attack the peace process, saying that you're just repeating North Korean propaganda, or your sunshine policy was meant to change North Korea, but it's actually just changing South Korea. And you're creating confusion about the South Korea-US alliance. So there was this real kind of kickback against the peace process from conservatives. And they said that by giving them assistance, you are just helping them to build nuclear weapons. And you just give all this assistance without receiving anything back. And I think peace movement kind of respond by talking about how, what is the nature of giving? What is the nature of giving something? Does it always have to be transactional? If we provide some humanitarian support, do we have to receive something tangible in return? Or is this actually focused on a longer term goal of peace and stability in the region? So I think, conservatives didn't really necessarily buy that argument at all. And the kind of argument became very polarized between people on the left advocating for a different approach to North Korea, advocating for engagement, and people on the right that kind of refused engagement completely. So I don't think that there has been a kind of successful reproach towards conservatives about their critique of inter-Korean cooperation and peace, in the same way that people on the left are still annoyed at conservatives for their understanding of the inter-Korean conflict and the way that they utilize the Korean conflict for political goals. So I don't think there's really at the moment, there's very little common ground between conservatives and liberals. And the fact is, we will go, if we now have a more liberal or center-left president, they will likely advocate a different approach to North Korea. And then if we get a conservative president after that, they will likely overturn that and change the policy completely, which is also one of the reasons why North Korea is less amenable to cooperation with South Korea, because they've seen that the policy can change completely when the president changes, because they have a very closed system. Cooperating with South Korea involves opening up that system a little bit, which involves some risk to the North Korean authorities or to the North Korean elite. So why do that if there's every chance that South Korea will flip to a different president and not continue their engagement policy? So I think, that the liberals and the conservatives in South Korea have completely different perspective on this, and that has had very real repercussions with North Korea's policy towards South Korea.
It sounds not so optimistic.
Right. It's bad. It's pessimistic time.
Yeah. And now for a conclusion, a bit a forward-looking question. In your opinion, what does a realistic path to peace of the Korean Peninsula look like? And can the South Korean peace movement play a more significant role in achieving that?
Yeah, okay. I want to talk a bit more about one challenge, if that's okay. There's a lot of talk about young people in South Korea not being interested in the peace process and not being interested in unification. Okay, so this is presumably a big problem for the peace process. And I think that the peace process needs to learn how to involve a new generation of people with ideas that resonate with young people who obviously have grown up with a different conception of what South Korea is and of what the inter-Korean relationship should be. So, for example, we talked about how important ethnic nationalism used to be for both Koreas. I think in South Korea, since the year 2000, instead of ethnic nationalism, we now see a much stronger kind of pride in South Korea rather than just Korean people per se. And I think there are lots of different reasons for that. But one would be to do with the fact that when South Korea made economic relations with China, and then ethnic Koreans started to come to South Korea from China, and then also in the 1990s when defectors from North Korea started to come to South Korea, you now have ethnic Koreans that South Koreans perceive as being very different to them, and in some ways being economically or politically inferior because of their backgrounds in living in socialist states. So whereas, this obviously, I think, weakens ethnic nationalism by the fact that for South Koreans, they can regard themselves as being somewhat different to these other ethnic Koreans that they were supposedly the same as. Okay, and then also South Korea, obviously, quite rightly, has a lot of pride about their democratization and about their economic development. I mean, they're the first country in the world to go from being a recipient of international aid to being a provider of international aid. The turnaround in South Korea is absolutely incredible. And then add to that, you have this increasing popularity of South Korean culture, right? K-pop, K-dramas, K-food, even like K-disease prevention during COVID. So all these things that South Koreans are proud about are very much related to South Korea rather than North Korea. And we know that the perception of North Korea on the international stage is often focuses just around nuclear weapons or just around Kim Jong-un or just around authoritarianism. So if you're a young South Korean, you wouldn't necessarily want to be associated with that country when your country is so successful. So I think that's a massive problem for the peace movement in South Korea, is how to construct a new discourse or narrative that can incorporate young people. It was also interesting that in 2018, when there was the Pyeongchang Olympics, there was this North South Korean hockey team, ice hockey team for the women's team, right? They had a joint team, and there was a lot of negative feeling about this within South Korea, especially among young people. And they said that it wasn't fair, it wasn't just, and that this was like depriving opportunity to the South Korean athletes that had worked so hard. So the individual didn't want to be subjugated to the group. Okay, so we know that in South Korea, the society is very competitive. It's very difficult to get into a good university, very difficult to get a good job, very difficult to get a house. I mean, I think South Korea has the highest amount of people in their 20s living with their parents out of all of the OECD countries, because it's so difficult to get a house, right? So you have these people in their 20s and 30s that in the past, that age group would have been like the leading group of new ideas about changing society, about building a peace process. But in Korea, because of the way that you have the economic system and the competition, they're too busy just trying to survive and just trying to get a good job, etc., rather than being able to be the leaders of a kind of social movement to talk about a future for South Korea. Okay, so I think that's a really something that we should try and understand their situation a bit more. And then also, obviously, the values in South Korea have also changed with democratization and with globalization. So the peace movement needs to figure out how to incorporate these values of justice and democracy into the peace process, because they are the values that resonate with young people in South Korea much more than the values that were important in the 1980s or 1990s. So these, I think, are the challenges. And at the same time, that is what the South Korean peace movement has to and is dealing with to move forward. I mean, they are dealing with this. There is a massive debate within South Korean NGOs and within academia about what does peace look like. Okay, what does it have to include unification? If not, what does it mean? What does it look like? So that is the debate that they are kind of having in South Korea at the moment. And one kind of argument is that, you know, with these international global values, then inter-Korean cooperation cannot mean just exploiting North Korean mineral resources or exploiting North Korean cheap labor. There has to be, you know, to improve the South Korean economy, there has to be something different. There has to be a new idea that wasn't tried in the 2000s. Okay, and I'd just like to finish in these debates about what the future looks like. some people are now saying that instead of unification, we could have two states that live peacefully side by side. So if you look at the surveys of South Koreans done by Seoul National University, they show that the kind of support for unification amongst young people is slowly decreasing, and the support for peaceful coexistence is slowly increasing. So it could be that Koreans decide, and it will be Koreans that decide, North Koreans and South Koreans, that two states is the way to go forward. And then at some point in the future, you then are able to move towards unification in the future, but maybe they need two states, peaceful coexistence first. I mean, but that's not by any way the consensus within the South Korean peace movement. That's just one kind of idea that exists. And I think in the meantime, while inter-Korean engagement is not possible, peace movement within South Korea will continue to try and get rid of this division violence, and also talk about how to move forward with the peace process in the future.
You said that the possibility of peaceful coexistence is much higher than anything else of the Korean Peninsula. So do you think if it's possible that a peace treaty could replace the Korean Armistice Agreement in near future?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have to, right? Because the alternative doesn't exist. There is no alternative to peace, okay? Because what we have at the moment, what Yoon Suk-yeol kept emphasizing, was peace through strength, okay? But the problem with peace through strength is that you always have to look over your shoulder. You're never sure what the intentions are of the other side. So you can never really feel security, right? And you don't know when is enough military sufficient. Like, when have you reached deterrence? When is the other side deterred? You never know. So you have to build more and more weapons. And that's what we see in North Korea at the moment, where they're exponentially increasing their nuclear weapons capability, right? Because we don't know when is the US deterred, and then we don't know when North Korea is deterred, right? So the problem is also, like, even if we do think that we have reached deterrence and we rely and we're safe and we are mutually deterred, we don't know how South Korean leaders or North Korean leaders perceive any one situation, right? So we could say, oh, this is about rationality. As long as everybody's rational, there won't be a conflict. But rationality is not objective, it's subjective. It depends on your own experiences and your situation and your understanding of the series of events that kind of unfold. So we know that Kim Jong-un said, if South Korea invades even 5 millimeters of North Korean territory, they would take it as a full-on attack, and they are willing to go for a full-on war, and that nuclear weapons can also be used against South Korea. So it's a very dangerous situation. It seems that Yoon Suk-yeol might have his defense minister tried to order the strike or the military attack on the place that was launching balloons towards South Korea. But if South Korea had done that, then who's to tell where the situation might have ended, right? Like, if South Korea did send drones into Pyongyang, how do we know that what the North Korean response would be rational and what would be irrational? We can't know. So that's the kind of problem with this peace through strength logic. We also know in 2002, when there was these North Korean missile tests, so South Korea tested missiles in response, okay? And they sent missiles from an airbase in Gangneung on the east coast of South Korea. And one of the missiles failed on launch and actually blew up back on the airfield in Gangneung. But if that had failed and hit the city of Gangneung, then civilians would have died, obviously. if it had failed and hit somewhere in North Korea, then North Korea would have took that as an attack on them. And again, we end up with the tragedy of wide-scale conflict. So unless you want to be a hostage to generals, military generals that have their finger poised over the buttons of all of these missiles pointing at each other, and that no longer talk every day on the telephone to each other to say that, oh no, that was a mistake, or oh no, don't worry, we're doing military drills, they're not aimed at you, then the only answer is a peace process. Otherwise, the devastation of war is only one mistake away. So there has to be change from the armistice to a lasting peace agreement. And the danger is that politicians continue to use the conflict for their own aims in North Korea, in South Korea, or in Washington, where it seemed that they were more interested in their kind of competition with China. And if North Korea falls into China's zone of influence, or Russia's zone of influence, then there's no more real negotiation with North Korea. But who's the victims there? The people of the Korean Peninsula, right? So I think that's why there has to be peace process. And hopefully, with changes in administration impending in South Korea and the US, hopefully a change will come. But who knows? Because there's a lot of other dynamics going on, right? I mean, if North Korea feels comfortable in its cooperation with Russia, or traditionally with China, then it has less need to negotiate with the US and with South Korea. So it's a very unsettling time, and we're really relying on the hard work and the ingenuity of the South Korean peace movement, because there isn't a civil society in North Korea. So we're relying on these South Korean people to provide us with opportunities and inspiration to deal with this ongoing 70-year conflict.
Then thank you so much for sharing such a precious expertise on this issue. Do you have anything to conclude with? Maybe something a bit inspiring.
I think the fact we met in Seoul, learning about inter-Korean relationship, learning about North Korea, and there were lots of other passionate foreigners there and passionate South Koreans there. So I think there are a lot of passionate people around the world that, and obviously primarily in the Korean Peninsula, that care about changing the future and making a brighter future. So that is inspiring. And it's important to remember that there is no road to peace. You cannot get to peace through strength. Peace is the road. Yeah. Peace is a process that and it's the only way. So it's inevitable that if we want to avoid conflict, we have to walk the road of peace. And we walk it together.
And to everyone watching, I want to remind that while challenges seem enormous, these moments like this in South Korea should remind us of the power of dialogue and hope.